Possum is a psychological mystery wearing the disguise of a horror movie. At its surface, it appears to be a story of a man haunted by some entity known only as Possum, a puppet he carries around with him in a bag throughout the movie with the head of a man and the body of a spider. It is unknown at first why he carries this monster around with him, and without going and watching the movie, I was left only to speculate. This, combined with the unsettling imagery, piqued my interest enough to get me to watch it, which I have to say, I am glad that I did. Before we get started, I feel obligated to put a spoiler warning here. We're going to be exploring themes which require us to talk about the plot of the movie, particularly the climax. So if you haven't seen the movie yet and would like a chance to do so without having the story revealed, go do that now. Arachnophobia is something that everyone probably already knows about. Spiders, yuck! Get them out of here! I don't like them. According to people much more smarterists than me am, there's an evolutionary advantage to not liking things like spiders or snakes because many of them are venomous, and if we get too close to them, we run the risk of being bitten and subsequently killed. Obviously, if that happens, you can no longer contribute to the gene pool, so the people who stayed away from them passed on that trait, and it's now hardwired into our DNA to not like them. As cheap as it may sound to play off of that, I think it was very expertly done in this movie. The uncanny valley is described as an eerie or unsettling feeling in response to something that is clearly meant to be human, but there's something not quite right about it. The whole idea arose in 1978 in regards to humanoid-looking robots and how people expressed revulsion towards them. The graph here shows the origin of the term. That valley in the graph where we dip below the line of human likeness, and a negative emotional response is triggered as a result. The phenomena extends beyond just robots, though, and can be experienced with a variety of other things. You've probably felt this yourself in response to images, and although this video is meant to have a more serious tone, I can't help but think of those memes of Mark Zuckerberg being something other than human. This has also been noted as something that comes up for certain individuals while watching the Polar Express, and in my personal experience while learning how a CPR dummy functions, I can tell you with 100% certainty that I've experienced this while staring into the face of that soulless abomination. Anyways, the point of all of this is to say that the reason I initially had any interest in this movie is because the monster design lands right at the very bottom of the uncanny valley. I applaud whoever dreamt up this horror because it is legitimately unsettling, but the design of this monster actually goes a lot deeper than just tapping into psychological phenomena. There is actually a story aspect to this design as well, and that has to do with trauma. The overarching theme of Possum's story is trauma, specifically childhood trauma. Philip is strange, and that is made obvious to us through things like his mannerisms and even just the way that he walks and talks. He almost looks unnatural in the way that he moves around and communicates. When I watched this movie for the first time, I did so with a friend, and I joked with them early on that Philip looks like he is both 4 and 40 at the same time. An observation I didn't realize until I got further into the movie was probably done deliberately. Philip's parents died in a house fire while he was still very young, and he was sent off to live with his uncle Maurice, who served as his caretaker for the rest of his childhood. During this time, Philip was subjected to horrible physical, emotional, and sexual abuse by his uncle, who wore a mask over his head as to not let Philip know that he was the one doing it. We get a glimpse into what Philip experienced during the climax of the movie, as Maurice pulls down Philip's pants to beat him before shoving his fingers into his mouth, an act which leaves Philip absolutely powerless and humiliated. Also, we don't explicitly see this, but it seems to be heavily implied that there was a sexual nature to the abuse that Philip faced as a child as well. The psychological trauma that Philip was subjected to effectively robbed him of his childhood, while also preventing him from ever truly being able to become an adult. He is simultaneously neither and both. People pick up on this cognitive dissonance between body and mind and understandably get the heebie-jeebies around him. In fact, Philip even seems uncomfortable inside of his own skin. Since Philip is more of a child than an adult in his mind, he seems to relate to children better. In fact, the only thing close to a positive social interaction he has in the course of the film is with a boy on a train named Michael when he asks about his drawings. But due to Philip's strange demeanor, even this ends with Michael's friends judging Philip, calling him a pedophile before leaving. The only real success in socializing that's ever suggested to us is in Philip's career as a puppeteer. But even this is short-lived, as Philip takes things too far with the unveiling of Possum and loses his job as a result. Since Philip doesn't know how to communicate, he's never had a chance to talk with anyone about what he's gone through, and those feelings became bottled up and repressed. Over time, enough pressure had built up in that bottle, and the darkest, most twisted thoughts are what seeped out from inside to manifest as the sinister puppet. The body of a spider, which taps into that primal fear we all share, represents the constant fear and disgust that Philip feels towards himself. The mouth agape just enough to fit a hand into, just like Maurice had done to Philip before. The glazed-over eyes staring with a look of complete dissociation, and general corpse-like appearance, likely having to do with the memories and emotions resurfacing that were thought to be long dead. All of the parts of himself that he hates, that he feels disgust towards, that he is terrified of, that he wishes not to remember. And Possum is Philip, in a sense. We can see this physically as well if you look closely at the silhouette of their faces. It might not be apparent at first, but there's an uncanny resemblance between the two that once seen cannot be unseen. All of this serves to function as what they refer to in psychology as a reenactment. A reenactment is when a victim of abuse will subconsciously seek to recreate their trauma in day-to-day life. I think this happens with all of us to some degree, but those who've experienced the worst of it can get to a point where they almost seem addicted to the trauma. No matter how badly they wish to forget about it and heal, they find themselves unable to. This is the state we find Philip in this movie, and this is why he made the puppet in the first place. Creating Possum must have served to be cathartic for Philip in some way, but mostly it serves to be a means of flagellation. He subjected himself to punishment by creating the puppet, and continues to punish himself as he struggles with the need to destroy it and the inability to carry out the act. An act which in a sense would mean that he is destroying himself. In order for growth, it is sometimes said that we must let our old selves die, and in doing so we can be reborn as something new, something better. Despite this sounding like a contradiction, Philip has become comfortable in the way he lives his life. To clarify, he knows how to exist the way he is currently existing, and in his mind, to make a change would be more difficult than to just keep bearing his hardships like he already knows how to do. In this sense, I think Possum serves as a foil to Philip, because it is forcing the thoughts to surface and removing the option for Philip to remain as he is. These thoughts are overbearing for Philip, though, and understandably so, it leaves him to question what is real or fake. Since we watch the film through the perspective of Philip, and he is unable to tell what is reality, we are left with a character type that is referred to as the Unreliable Narrator. As the film is approaching its climax, both Philip and the viewer are left questioning what is or is not real. We've witnessed Philip's mental state degrade over the course of the movie, and we've seen multiple examples of Philip's memory being unreliable. When Maurice informs Philip that the police are looking for him, he starts to seriously question whether or not he's actually done what everyone seems to think he has. The thought of carrying out the same atrocities which he was subjected to horrifies Philip, and this only serves to feed into Philip's doubt in his own memory. It's a vicious cycle which essentially leaves him to gaslight himself over and over again until he eventually becomes completely detached, envisioning the puppet returning once again to chase him through a dark, dreary, abandoned building. The chase itself implies a few other things about Philip's psyche. At certain points it seems that Possum is the one doing the hunting, while at other points coming off as trepidatious towards Philip. When the chase finally resolves, we can see Philip on his knees being embraced by Possum, an act which I can only speculate is Philip subconsciously facing his fears and accepting the part of him that he previously viewed as disgusting, revolting, and inhuman. He's finally taking the first steps towards healing, and this brings us to the climax. Philip returns home looking for Maurice, but he is not there. Overwhelmed in emotion and still confused, Philip begins banging his head on the wall and gets a glimpse of himself as Possum in the mirror. After hearing a thud, Philip collects himself and ventures to a closed-off room which was presumably his parents' room. He finds a bottle resting in front of an old headboard containing teeth and holds it up to the light. It seems to me in this moment that Philip is finally trying to come to terms with the death of his parents, but is suddenly and violently interrupted by a masked man who shoves a bag over Philip's head in an attempt to subdue him. After being wrestled to the floor, the masked man pulls the bag off of Philip's head and reveals that he is Maurice. He mocks Philip, beats him, and forces him to open his mouth, where he proceeds to shove his fingers into. Maurice continues to mock him as he forces Philip to turn over and remove his pants, insisting that Philip has known this whole time that Maurice was the masked man from his childhood and never told anyone. Maurice then begins to whip Philip's bare bottom with a belt, mimicking a form of punishment that a child would receive. As he's being beaten, Philip hears thuds and muffled screams coming from a trunk in the room. Realizing that Maurice is in fact the one who kidnapped the child and is planning on performing these same acts on another poor boy, finally gives Philip the courage he needs to fight back. He turns around and overpowers Maurice, forcing him to the broken floor. Maurice continues to taunt Philip, prodding him with his erection, asking, "Can you feel that, boy?" Philip remains unfazed by this, and continues to slowly push Maurice's head into the broken floor until enough force is finally applied to break his neck and kill him. Philip stands up, collects himself, and opens the trunk. The boy crawls out from inside of it and is freed. Although by definition this is technically a happy ending, instead of happiness we are left only to feel uneasy, unsure, and discontent. The final scene of the film is of Philip sitting alone, surrounded by junk, blanketed by a murky gray sky, and wearing a look on his face that could either mean he is very deep in thought or completely void of it altogether. There's a dissonance here that has been present throughout the entire film. The only difference now is that we understand why it's there. We know that Philip will never truly be able to heal from this. He'll never be able to feel normal, and he will always be broken. The discomfort we feel at this revelation is only a taste of what haunts Philip on a constant basis, and knowing that is truly horrifying. It's horrifying for the same reason that the monster is horrifying. Because in Possum, we can now see something even more familiar. Ourselves, or rather, a version of ourselves that could have existed given the right circumstances. Possum serves as a glimpse into a world that most of us have only ever been able to dip our toes into. Not the void itself, but the after effects of someone who was forced to stare into the void until it eventually stared back.